Have you ever thought a story isn't always what's told aloud? Sometimes it's what time tries to bury. Tonight's story is just like that. Sometimes bitter, sometimes true, and sometimes a question that lingers in your mind and heart. If your day has been full of noise, scrolling through endless screens, then maybe this moment is just for you. Put on your headphones, dim the lights, and let yourself drift into a story that's not just meant to be heard, but felt. And if our way of storytelling speaks to you, don't forget to subscribe because we bring moments like this just for you.
Part 3. After nearly 7 weeks passed in this agitating state, suddenly on one morning, the earliest and the loveliest of dawning spring, a change was announced to us all as having taken place in Margaret. But it was a change, alas, that ushered in the last great change of all. The conflict which had for so long a period raged within her and overthrown her reason was at an end. The strife was over, and nature was settling into an everlasting rest. In the course of the night she had recovered her senses. When the morning light penetrated through her curtain, she recognized her attendants, made inquiries as to the month and the day of the month, and then, sensible that she could not outlive the day, she requested that her confessor might be summoned. About an hour and a half the confessor remained alone with her. At the end of that time he came out and hastily summoned the attendants, for Margaret, he said, was sinking into a fainting fit. The confessor himself might have passed through many a fit, so much was he changed by the results of this interview. I crossed him coming out of the house. I spoke to him, I called to him, but he heard me not. He saw me not. He saw nobody. Onward he strode to the cathedral, where Maximilian was sure to be found, pacing upon the graves. Him he seized by the arm, whispered something into his ear, and then both retired into one of the many sequestered chapels in which lights are continually burning. There they had some conversation, but not very long, for within 5 minutes Maximilian strode away to the house in which his young wife was dying. One step seemed to carry him upstairs. The attendants, according to the directions they had received from the physicians, mustered at the head of the stairs to oppose him. But that was idle. Before the rights which he held as a lover and a husband, before the still more sacred rights of grief which he carried in his countenance, and all opposition fled like a dream. There was, besides, a fury in his eye. A motion of his hand waved them off like summer flies. He entered the room, and once again, for the last time, he was in company with his beloved. What passed, who could pretend to guess? Something more than 2 hours had elapsed, during which Margaret had been able to talk occasionally, which was known, because at times the attendants heard the sound of Maximilian's voice, evidently in tones of reply to something which she had said. At the end of that time a little bell, placed near the bedside, was rung hastily. A fainting fit had seized Margaret, but she recovered almost before her women applied the usual remedies. They lingered, however, a little, looking at the youthful couple with an interest which no restraints availed to check. Their hands were locked together, and in Margaret's eyes there gleamed a farewell light of love, which settled upon Maximilian, and seemed to indicate that she was becoming speechless. Just at this moment she made a feeble effort to draw Maximilian toward her. He bent forward and kissed her with an anguish that made the most callous weep, and then he whispered something into her ear, upon which the attendants retired, taking this as a proof that their presence was a hindrance to a free communication. But they heard no more talking, and in less than 10 minutes they returned. Maximilian and Margaret still retained their former position. Their hands were fast locked together. The same parting ray of affection, the same farewell light of love, was in the eye of Margaret, and still it settled upon Maximilian. But her eyes were beginning to grow dim. Mists were rapidly stealing over them. Maximilian, who sat stupefied, and like one not in his right mind, now, at the gentle request of the women, resigned his seat, for the hand which had clasped his had already relaxed its hold. The farewell gleam of love had departed. One of the women closed her eyes, and there fell asleep forever the loveliest flower that our city had reared for generations. The funeral took place on the 4th day after her death. In the morning of that day, from strong affection, having known her from an infant, I begged permission to see the corpse. She was in her coffin. Snowdrops and crocuses were laid upon her innocent bosom, and roses of that sort which the season allowed over her person. These and other lovely symbols of youth, of springtime, and of resurrection caught my eye for the first time. But in the next it fell upon her face. Mighty God, what a change! What a transfiguration! Still, indeed, there was the same innocent sweetness. Still, there was something of the same loveliness. The expression still remained. But for the features, all trace of flesh seemed to have vanished. Mere outline of bony structure remained, mere pencilings and shadowings of what she once had been. "This is indeed," I exclaimed, "dust to dust, ashes to ashes." Maximilian, to the astonishment of everybody, attended the funeral. It was celebrated in the cathedral. All made way for him, and at times he seemed collected, at times he reeled like one who was drunk. He heard as one who hears not, he saw as one in a dream. The whole ceremony went on by torchlight, and toward the close he stood like a pillar, motionless, torpid, frozen. But the great burst of the choir, and the mighty blare ascending from our vast organ at the closing of the grave, recalled him to himself, and he strode rapidly homeward. Half an hour after I returned, I was summoned to his bedroom. He was in bed, calm and collected. What he said to me I remember as if it had been yesterday, and the very tone with which he said it, although more than 20 years have passed since then. He began thus: "I have not long to live." And when he saw me smart, suddenly awakened into a consciousness that perhaps he had taken poison, and meant to intimate as much, he continued, "You fancy I have taken poison. No matter whether I have or not. If I have, the poison is such that no antidote will now avail, or if they would, you well know that some griefs are of a kind which leave no opening to any hope. What difference, therefore, can it make whether I leave this earth today, tomorrow, or the next day? Be assured of this, that whatever I have determined to do is past all power of being affected by human opposition. Occupy yourself not with any fruitless attempts, but calmly listen to me, else I know what to do." Seeing a suppressed fury in his eye, notwithstanding I saw also some change stealing over his features, as if some subtle poison beginning to work upon his frame, awestruck, I consented to listen, and sat still. "It is well that you do so, for my time is short. Here is my will legally drawn up, and you will see that I have committed an immense property to your discretion. Here again is a paper still more important in my eyes. It is also testamentary, and binds you to duties which may not be so easy to execute as the disposal of my property. But now listen to something else which concerns neither of these papers. Promise me in the first place solemnly that whenever I die you will see me buried in the same grave as my wife, from whose funeral we are just returned. Promise." I promised. "Swear." I swore. "Finally, promise me that when you read this second paper which I have put into your hands, whatsoever you may think of it, you will say nothing, publish nothing to the world until 3 years shall have passed." I promised. "And now farewell for 3 hours. Come to me about 10 o'clock, and take a glass of wine in memory of old times." This he said laughingly, but even then a dark spasm crossed his face. Yet thinking that this might be the mere working of a mental anguish within him, I complied with his desire and retired. Feeling, however, but little at ease, I devised an excuse for looking in upon him about 1 hour and a half after I had left him. I knocked gently at the door. There was no answer. I knocked louder. Still no answer. I went in. The light of day was gone, and I could see nothing, but I was alarmed by the utter stillness of the room. I listened earnestly, but not a breath could be heard. I rushed back hastily into the hall for a lamp. I returned. I looked in upon this marvel of manly beauty, and the first glance informed me that he and all his splendid endowments had departed forever. He had died, probably, soon after I left him, and had dismissed me from some growing instinct which informed him that his last agonies were at hand. I took up his two testamentary documents. Both were addressed in the shape of letters to myself. The first was a rapid though distinct appropriation of his enormous property. General rules were laid down upon which property was to be distributed, but the details were left to my discretion and to the guidance of circumstances as they should happen to emerge from the various inquiries which it would become necessary to set on foot. This first document I soon laid aside, both because I found that its provisions were dependent for their meaning upon the second, and because to this second document I looked with confidence for a solution of many mysteries, of the profound sadness which had, from the first of my acquaintance with him, possessed a man so gorgeously endowed as the favorite of nature and fortune, of his motives for huddling up, in a clandestine manner, that connection which formed the glory of his life, and possibly, but then I hesitated, of the late unintelligible murders, which still lay under as profound a cloud as ever. Much of this would be unveiled, all might be, and there and then, with the corpse lying beside me of the gifted and mysterious writer, I seated myself and read the following statement. March 26, 1817. My trial is finished. My conscience, my duty, my honor are liberated. My warfare is accomplished. Margaret, my innocent young wife, I have seen for the last time. Her, the crown that might have been of my earthly felicity. Her, the one temptation to put aside the bitter cup which awaited me. Her, sole seductress, O innocent seductress, from the stern duties which my fate had imposed upon me. Her, even her, I have sacrificed. Before I go, partly lest the innocent should be brought into question for acts almost exclusively mine, but still more lest the lesson and the warning which God by my hand has written in blood upon your guilty walls should perish for want of its authentic exposition, hear my last dying avowal, that the murders which have desolated so many families within your walls, and made the household hearth no sanctuary, age no charter of protection, are all due originally to my head, if not always to my hand, as the minister of a dreadful retribution. That account of my history and my prospects which you received from the Russian diplomatist, among some errors of little importance, is essentially correct. My father was not so immediately connected with English blood as is there represented. However, it is true that he claimed descent from an English family of even higher distinction than that which is assigned in the Russian statement. He was proud of this English descent, and the more so as the war with revolutionary France brought out more prominently than ever the moral and civil grandeur of England. This pride was generous, but it was imprudent in his situation. His immediate progenitors had been settled in Italy, at Rome first, but later at Milan, and his whole property, large and scattered, came, by the progress of the Revolution, to stand under French domination. Many spoliations he suffered, but still he was too rich to be seriously injured. But he foresaw in the progress of events still greater perils menacing his most capital resources. Many of the states or princes in Italy were deeply in his debt, and in great convulsions which threatened his country, he saw that both the contending parties would find a colorable excuse for absolving themselves from engagements which pressed unpleasantly upon their finances. In this embarrassment he formed an intimacy with a French officer of high rank and high principle. My father's friend saw his danger, and advised him to enter the French service. In his young days my father had served extensively under many princes, and had found in every other military service a spirit of honor governing the conduct of the officers. Here only, and for the first time, he found ruffian manners and universal rapacity. He could not draw his sword in company with such men, nor in such a cause. But at length, under the pressure of necessity, he accepted, or rather bought with an immense bribe, the place of a commissary to the French forces in Italy. With this one resource, eventually he succeeded in making good the whole of his public claims upon the Italian states. These vast sums he remitted through various channels to England, where he became proprietor in the funds to an immense amount. Incautiously, however, something of this transpired, and the result was doubly unfortunate. For while his intentions were thus made known as finally pointing to England, which of itself made him an object of hatred and suspicion, it also diminished his means of bribery. These considerations, along with another, made some French officers of high rank and influence the bitter enemies of my father. My mother, whom he had married when holding a brigadier general's commission in the Austrian service, was by birth and by religion a Jewess. She was of exquisite beauty, and had been sought in morganatic marriage by an archduke of the Austrian family, but she had relied upon his plea that hers was the purest and noblest blood among all Jewish families, that her family traced themselves by tradition and a vast series of attestations under the hands of the Jewish high priests to the Maccabees and to the royal houses of Judea, and that for her it would be a degradation to accept even a sovereign prince on the terms of such marriage. This was no vain pretension of ostentatious vanity. It was one which had been admitted as valid from time immemorial in Transylvania and adjacent countries, where my mother's family were rich and honored, and took their seat among the dignitaries of the land. The French officers I have alluded to, without capacity for anything so dignified as a deep passion, but merely in pursuit of a vagrant fancy that would on the next day have given place to another equally fleeting, had dared to insult my mother with proposals the most licentious, proposals as much below her rank and birth as at any rate they would have been below her dignity of mind and her purity. These she had communicated to my father, who bitterly resented the chains of subordination which tied up his hands from avenging his injuries. Still his eye told a tale which his superiors could brook as little as they could the disdainful neglect of his wife. More than one had been concerned in the injuries to my father and mother. More than one were interested in obtaining revenge. Things could be done in German towns, and by favor of old German laws or usages, which even in France could not have been tolerated. This my father's enemies well knew, but this my father also knew, and he endeavored to lay down his office of commissary. That, however, was a favor which he could not obtain. He was compelled to serve on the German campaign then commencing, and on the subsequent one in Friedland and Eylau. Here he was caught in some one of the snares laid for him, first trepanned into an act which violated some rule of the service, and then provoked into a breach of discipline against the general officer who had thus trepanned him. Now was the long-sought opportunity gained, and in that very quarter of Germany best fitted for improving it. My father was thrown into prison in your city, subjected to the atrocious oppression of your jailer, and the more detestable oppression of your local laws. The charges against him were thought even to affect his life, and he was humbled into suing for permission to send for his wife and children. Already to his proud spirit it was punishment enough that he should be reduced to sue for favor to one of his bitterest foes, but it was no part of their plan to refuse that. By way of expediting my mother's arrival, a military courier, with every facility for the journey, was forwarded to her without delay. My mother, her 2 daughters, and myself were then residing in Venice. I had, through the aid of my father's connections in Austria, been appointed in the imperial service, and held a high commission for my age. But on my father's marching northward with the French army, I had been recalled as an indispensable support to my mother. Not that my years could have made me such, for I had barely accomplished my 12th year, but my premature growth and my military station had given me considerable knowledge of the world and presence of mind. Our journey I pass over, but as I approach your city, that sepulchre of honor and happiness to my poor family. My heart beats with frantic emotions. Never do I see that venerable dome of your minster from the forest, but I curse its form, which reminds me of what we then surveyed for many a mile as we traversed the forest. For leagues before we approached the city, this object lay before us in relief upon the frosty blue sky, and still it seemed never to increase. Such was the complaint of my little sister Miriam. Most innocent child, would that it never had increased for thy eyes, but remained forever at a distance. That same hour began the series of monstrous indignities which terminated the career of my ill-fated family. As we drew up to the city gates, the officer who inspected the passports, finding my mother and sisters described as Jewesses, which in my mother's ears, reared in a region where Jews are not dishonored, always sounded a title of distinction, summoned a subordinate agent, who in coarse terms demanded his toll. We presumed this to be a road tax for the carriage and the horses, and we were quickly undeceived. A small sum was demanded for each of my sisters and my mother, as for so many head of cattle. I, fancying some mistake, spoke to the man temperately, and to do him justice, he did not seem desirous of insulting me, but he produced a printed board on which, along with the vilest animals, Jews and Jewesses were rated at so much a head. While we were debating the point, the officers of the gate wore a sneering smile upon their faces. The postilions were laughing together, and this too in the presence of three creatures whose exquisite beauty, in different styles, agreeably to their different ages, would have caused noblemen to have fallen down and worshipped. My mother, who had never yet met with any flagrant insult on account of her national distinctions, was too much shocked to be able to speak. I whispered to her a few words, recalling her to her native dignity of mind, paid the money, and we drove to the prison. But the hour was past at which we could be admitted, and as Jewesses, my mother and sisters could not be allowed to stay in the city. They were to go into the Jewish quarter, a part of the suburb set apart for Jews, in which it was scarcely possible to obtain a lodging tolerably clean. My father, on the next day, we found to our horror at the point of death. To my mother he did not tell the worst of what he had endured. To me he told that, driven to madness by the insults offered to him, he had upbraided the court-martial with their corrupt propensities, and had even mentioned that overtures had been made to him for quashing the proceedings in return for a sum of 2 millions of francs, and that his sole reason for not entertaining the proposal was his distrust of those who made it. They would have taken the money, said he, and then found a pretext for putting me to death, that I might tell no secrets. This was too near the truth to be tolerated. In concert with the local authorities, the military enemies of my father conspired against him. Witnesses were suborned, and finally, under some antiquated law of the place, he was subjected in secret to a mode of torture which still lingers in the east of Europe. He sank under the torture and the degradation. I, too, thoughtlessly, but by a natural movement of filial indignation, suffered the truth to escape me in conversing with my mother, and she... But I will preserve the regular succession of things. My father died, but he had taken such measures in concert with me that his enemies should never benefit by his property. Meantime, my mother and sisters had closed my father's eyes, had attended his remains to the grave, and in every act connected with this last sad rite had met with the insults and degradations too mighty for human patience. My mother now became incapable of self-command in the fury of her righteous grief. Publicly and in court denounced the conduct of the magistracy, taxed some of them with the vilest proposals to herself, taxed them as a body with having used instruments of torture upon my father, and finally accused them of collusion with the French military oppressors of the district. This last was a charge under which they quailed, for by that time the French had made themselves odious to all who retained a spark of patriotic feeling. My heart sank within me when I looked up at the bench, this tribunal of tyrants, all purple or livid with rage. When I looked at them alternately, and at my noble mother with her weeping daughters, these so powerless, these so basely vindictive, and locally so omnipotent, willingly I would have sacrificed all my wealth for a simple permission to quit this infernal city, with my poor female relations safe and undishonoured. But far other were the intentions of that incensed magistracy. My mother was arrested, charged with some offence equal to petty treason, or scandalo magnatum, or the sowing of sedition; and though what she said was true, where, alas, was she to look for evidence? Here was seen the want of gentlemen. Gentlemen, had they been even equally tyrannical, would have recoiled with shame from taking vengeance on a woman. And what a vengeance! O heavenly powers, that I should live to mention such a thing! Man that is born of woman, to inflict upon woman personal scourging on the bare back, and through the streets at noonday! Even for Christian women the punishment was severe which the laws assigned to the offence in question; but for Jewesses, by one of the ancient laws against that persecuted people, far heavier and more degrading punishments were annexed to almost every offence. What else could be looked for in a city which welcomed its Jewish guests by valuing them at the gates as brute beasts? Sentence was passed, and the punishment was to be inflicted on 2 separate days, with an interval between each, doubtless to prolong the tortures of mind, but under a vile pretense of alleviating the physical torture. 3 days after would come the first day of punishment. My mother spent the time in reading her native scriptures. She spent it in prayer and in musing, while her daughters clung and wept around her day and night, grovelling on the ground at the feet of any people in authority that entered their mother's cell. That same interval, how was it passed by me? Now mark, my friend, every man in office, or that could be presumed to bear the slightest influence, every wife, mother, sister, daughter of such men, I besieged morning, noon, and night. I wearied them with my supplications. I humbled myself to the dust. I, the haughtiest of God's creatures, knelt and prayed to them for the sake of my mother. I besought them that I might undergo the punishment 10 times over in her stead; and once or twice I did obtain the encouragement of a few natural tears, given more, however, as I was told, to my piety than to my mother's deserts. But rarely was I heard out with patience, and from some houses repelled with personal indignities. The day came. I saw my mother half undressed by the base officials. I heard the prison gates expand. I heard the trumpets of the magistracy sound. She had warned me what to do. I had warned myself. Would I sacrifice a retribution sacred and comprehensive for the momentary triumph over an individual? If not, let me forbear to look out of doors. For I felt that in the self-same moment in which I saw the dog of an executioner raise his accursed hand against my mother, swifter than the lightning would my dagger search his heart. When I heard the roar of the cruel mob, I paused, endured, forbore. I stole out by by-lanes of the city from my poor exhausted sisters, whom I left sleeping in each other's innocent arms, into the forest. There I listened to the shouting populace. There even I fancied that I could trace my poor mother's route by the course of the triumphant cries. There, even then I made, O silent forest, thou heardst me when I made, a vow that I have kept too faithfully. Mother, thou art avenged. Sleep, daughters of Jerusalem, for at length the oppressor sleeps with thee, and thy poor son has paid, in discharge of his vow, the forfeit of his own happiness, of a paradise opening upon earth, of a heart as innocent as thine, and a face as fair. I returned, and found my mother returned. She slept by starts, but she was feverish and agitated, and when she awoke and first saw me, she blushed, as if I could think that real degradation had settled upon her. Then it was that I told her of my vow. Her eyes were lambent with fierce light for a moment, but when I went on more eagerly to speak of my hopes and projects, She called me to her, kissed me, and whispered, "Oh, not so, my son. Think not of me, think not of vengeance. Think only of poor Berenice and Miriam." Ay, that thought was startling. Yet this magnanimous and forbearing mother, as I knew by the report of one faithful female servant, had in the morning, during her bitter trial, behaved as might have become a daughter of Judas Maccabeus. She had looked serenely upon the vile mob, and awed them by her serenity. She had disdained to utter a shriek when the cruel lash fell upon her fair skin. There is a point that makes the triumph over natural feelings of pain easy or not easy, the degree to which we count upon the sympathy of the bystanders. My mother had it not in the beginning, but long before the end her celestial beauty, the divinity of injured innocence, the pleading of common womanhood in the minds of the lowest class, and the reaction of manly feeling in the men, had worked a great change on the mob. Some began now to threaten those who had been active in insulting her. The silence of awe and respect succeeded to noise and uproar, and feelings which they scarcely understood mastered the rude rabble as they witnessed more and more the patient fortitude of the sufferer. Menaces began to rise toward the executioner. Things wore such an aspect that the magistrates put a sudden end to the scene. That day we received permission to go home to our poor house in the Jewish quarter. I know not whether you are learned enough in Jewish usages to be aware that in every Jewish house, where old traditions are kept up, there was one room consecrated to confusion, a room always locked up and sequestered from vulgar use, except on occasions of memorable affliction, where everything is purposely in disorder, broken, shattered, mutilated, to typify, by symbols appalling to the eye, the desolation which has so long trampled on Jerusalem, and the ravages of the boar within the vineyards of Judea. My mother, as a Hebrew princess, maintained all traditional customs. Even in this wretched suburb she had her chamber of desolation. There it was that I and my sisters heard her last words. The rest of her sentence was to be carried into effect within a week. She meantime had disdained to utter any word of fear, but that energy of self-control had made the suffering the more bitter. Fever and dreadful agitation had succeeded. Her dreams showed sufficiently to us, who watched her couch, that terror for the future mingled with a sense of degradation for the past. Nature asserted her rights, but the more she shrank from the suffering, the more did she proclaim how severe it had been, and consequently how noble the self-conquest. Yet, as her weakness increased, so did her terror, until I besought her to take comfort, assuring her that in case any attempt should be made to force her out again to public exposure, I would kill the man who came to execute the order, that we would all die together, and there would be a common end to her injuries and her fears. She was reassured by what I told her of my belief that no future attempt would be made upon her. She slept more tranquilly, but her fever increased, and slowly she slept away into the everlasting sleep which knows of no tomorrow. Here came a crisis in my fate. Should I stay and attempt to protect my sisters? But alas, what power had I to do so among our enemies? Rachel and I consulted, and many a scheme we planned. Even while we consulted, and the very night after my mother had been committed to the Jewish burying ground, came an officer bearing an order for me to repair to Vienna. Some officer in the French army, having watched the transaction respecting my parents, was filled with shame and grief. He wrote a statement of the whole to an Austrian officer of rank, my father's friend, who obtained from the emperor an order claiming me as a page of his own, and an officer in the household service. O heavens, what a neglect that it did not include my sisters! However, the next best thing was that I should use my influence at the imperial court to get them passed to Vienna. This I did to the utmost of my power, but 7 months elapsed before I saw the emperor. If my applications ever met his eye, he might readily suppose that your city, my friend, was as safe a place as another for my sisters. nor did I myself know all its dangers. At length, with the emperor's leave of absence, I returned, and what did I find? 8 months had passed, and the faithful Rachel had died. The poor sisters, clinging together, but utterly bereft of friends, knew not which way to turn. In this abandonment they fell into the insidious hands of the ruffian jailer. My eldest sister Berenice, the stateliest and noblest of beauties, had attracted this ruffian's admiration while she was in prison with her mother; and when I returned to your city, armed with the imperial passports for all, I found that Berenice had died in the villain's custody. Nor could I obtain anything beyond a legal certificate of her death. And finally, the blooming, laughing Miriam, she had also died, and of affliction for the loss of her sister. You, my friend, had been absent upon your travels during the calamitous history I have recited. You had seen neither my father nor my mother. But you came in time to take under your protection, from the abhorred wretch the jailer, my little broken-hearted Miriam. And when sometimes you fancied that you had seen me under other circumstances, in her it was, my dear friend, and in her features that you saw mine. Now was the world a desert to me. I cared little in the way of love which way I turned, but in the way of hatred I cared everything. I transferred myself to the Russian service with the view of gaining some appointment on the Polish frontier, which might put it in my power to execute my vow of destroying all the magistrates of your city. War, however, raged, and carried me into far other regions. It ceased, and there was little prospect that another generation would see it relighted; for the disturber of peace was a prisoner forever, and all nations were exhausted. Now, then, it became necessary that I should adopt some new mode for executing my vengeance, and the more so because annually some were dying of those whom it was my mission to punish. A voice ascended to me day and night from the graves of my father and mother, calling for vengeance before it should be too late. I took my measures thus. Many Jews were present at Waterloo. From among these, all irritated against Napoleon for the expectations he had raised only to disappoint, by his great assembly of Jews at Paris, I selected 8, whom I knew familiarly as men hardened by military experience against the movements of pity. With these as my beagles, I hunted for some time in your forest before opening my regular campaign; and I am surprised that you did not hear of the death which met the executioner, him, I mean, who dared to lift his hand against my mother. This man I met by accident in the forest, and I slew him. I talked with the wretch as a stranger at first upon the memorable case of the Jewish lady. Had he relented, had he expressed compunction, I might have relented. But far otherwise. The dog, not dreaming to whom he spoke, exulted. But why repeat the villain's words? I cut him to pieces. Next I did this. My agents I caused to matriculate separately at the college. They assumed the college dress, and now marked the solution of that mystery which caused such perplexity. Simply as students, we all had an unsuspected admission to any house. Just then there was a common practice, as you will remember, among the younger students, of going out a-masking, that is, of entering houses in the academic dress and with the face masked. This practice subsisted even during the most intense alarm from the murders, for the dress of the students was supposed to bring protection along with it. But even after suspicion had connected itself with this dress, it was sufficient that I should appear unmasked at the head of the maskers to ensure them a friendly reception. Hence the facility with which death was inflicted, and that unaccountable absence of any motion toward an alarm. I took hold of my victim, and he looked at me with smiling security. Our weapons were hid under our academic robes, and even when we drew them out, and at the moment of applying them to the threat, they still supposed our gestures to be part of the pantomime we were performing. Did I relish this abuse of personal confidence in myself? No, I loathed it, and I grieved for its necessity. For my mother, a phantom not seen with bodily eyes, but ever present in my mind, continually ascended before me, and still I shouted aloud to my astounded victim, "This comes from the Jewess, hound of hounds. Do you remember the Jewess whom you dishonored, and the oaths which you broke in order that you might dishonor her, and the righteous law which you violated, and the cry of anguish from her son which you scoffed at?" Who I was, what I avenged, and whom, I made every man aware, and every woman, before I punished them. The details of the cases I need not repeat. One or two I was obliged at the beginning to commit to my Jews. The suspicion was thus from the first turned aside by the notoriety of my presence elsewhere. But I took care that none suffered who had not either been upon the guilty list of magistrates who condemned the mother, or of those who turned away with mockery from the supplication of the son. It pleased God, however, to place a mighty temptation in my path which might have persuaded me to forego all thoughts of vengeance, to forget my vow, to forget the voices which invoked me from the grave. This was Margaret Liebenheim. Oh, how terrific appeared my duty of bloody retribution, after her angel's face and angel's voice had calmed me. With respect to her grandfather, strange it is to mention that never did my innocent wife appear so lovely as precisely in the relation of granddaughter. So beautiful was her goodness to the old man, and so divine was the childlike innocence on her part, contrasted with the guilty recollections associated with him, for he was among the guiltiest toward my mother. Still I delayed his punishment to the last, and for his child's sake I would have pardoned him. Nay, I had resolved to do so, when a fierce Jew, who had a deep malignity toward this man, swore that he would accomplish his vengeance at all events, and perhaps might be obliged to include Margaret in the ruin, unless I adhered to the original scheme. Then I yielded, for circumstances armed this man with momentary power. But the night fixed on was one in which I had reason to know that my wife would be absent, for so I had myself arranged with her, and the unhappy counter-arrangement I do not yet understand. Let me add that the sole purpose of my clandestine marriage was to sting her grandfather's mind with the belief that his family had been dishonored, even as he had dishonored mine. He learned, as I took care that he should, that his granddaughter carried about with her the promises of a mother, and did not know that she had the sanction of a wife. This discovery made him in one day become eager for the marriage he had previously opposed, and the discovery also embittered the misery of his death. At that moment I attempted to think only of my mother's wrongs. But in spite of all I could do, this old man appeared to me in the light of Margaret's grandfather, and had I been left to myself he would have been saved. As it was, never was horror equal to mine when I met her flying to his succor. I had relied upon her absence, and the misery of that moment, when her eye fell upon me in the very act of seizing her grandfather, far transcended all else that I have suffered in these terrific scenes. She fainted in my arms, and I and another carried her upstairs and procured water. Meantime her grandfather had been murdered, even while Margaret fainted. I had, however, under the fear of discovery, though never anticipating a re-encounter with herself, forestalled the explanation requisite in such a case to make my conduct intelligible. I had told her under feigned names the story of my mother and my sisters. She knew their wrongs. She had heard me contend for the right of vengeance. Consequently, in our parting interview, one word only was required to place myself in a new position to her thoughts. I needed only to say I was that son. That unhappy mother, so miserably degraded and outraged, was mine. As to the jailer, he was met by a party of us. Not suspecting that any of us could be connected with the family, he was led to talk in the most hideous details with regard to my poor Berenice. The child had not, as he had insinuated, aided her own degradation, but had nobly sustained the dignity of her sex and her family. Such advantages as the monster pretended to have gained over her, sick, desolate, and latterly delirious, were by his own confession not obtained without violence. That was too much. 40,000 lives, had he possessed them, could not have gratified my thirst for revenge. Yet had he but showed courage, he should have died the death of a soldier. But the wretch showed cowardice, the most abject, but you know his fate. Now, then, all is finished, and human nature is avenged. Yet if you complain of the bloodshed and the terror, think of the wrongs which created my rights. Think of the sacrifice by which I gave a tenfold strength to those rights. Think of the necessity for a dreadful concussion and shock to society in order to carry my lesson into the councils of princes. This will now have been effected, and ye, victims of dishonor, will be glorified in your deaths. You will not have suffered in vain, nor died without a monument. Sleep, therefore, Sister Berenice. Sleep, gentle Marian, in peace. And thou, noble mother, let the outrages sown in thy dishonor rise again and blossom in wild harvests of honor for the women of thy afflicted race. Sleep, daughters of Jerusalem, in the sanctity of your sufferings. And thou, if it be possible, even more beloved daughter of a Christian fold, whose company was too soon denied to him in life, upon thy grave to receive him, who in the hour of death wishes to remember no title which he wore on earth but that of thy chosen and adoring lover.
This is where the story ends. How did you like it? If you enjoyed it, please leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like any changes in the story, feel free to share. Share this story with your friends who are seeking peace amidst their busy lives. It might just bring them some comfort. Also, subscribing to our channel would mean a lot to us, and your support will bring us joy. See you in the next story. Until then, goodbye.